Hello and welcome to another episode of Trash to Track. Now in this episode we're going to be looking at this Hornby Mallard that was donated to me by a chap called Peter Entwistle and we unboxed a few videos ago. Now this model is in pretty poor condition at the minute. It's missing a safety valve on the roof and the whistle. The body shell is loose from the chassis. It's missing a cylinder. The motor is loose and it's got simplified printing on there as per the Hornby standard, but the model itself is in a pretty bad way. Now I reckon this has been dropped on the floor at some point to cause this amount of damage. This piece of tape here had gone manky and horrible, so sticky. The motor is unclipped because the motor bracket itself is broken. The cylinder, as I said, is missing and the valve gears are badly bent. There's also the odd handrail on the tender missing, and this tender drawbar is bent. This is a bit of a strange idea. These are permanently coupled together, which results in the handling of the model quite hard, to be honest. As I said, the tender's missing its rear buffers as well. This drawbar I'm going to remove because it needs straightening out. And I've also noticed that two tyres on the tender wheels have also come adrift. So there's quite a bit to get my teeth into on this rebuild. So you can see there the badly bent side rods and piston valves. That motor is very loose. So I'm going to start by disassembling the model and I'm going to remove the front Bogie wheel because that seems to be in good condition, so I'm going to take that out of the way and keep that aside. This motor setup here, I'm just going to check the idler gear. This isn't cracked. In fact, looking at the grease and lubrication in this model, it's still clean white grease. I don't think this model has had a lot of running before it was dropped at all, really. I'm removing the screws and the remnants of that motor mount there. This really is gone beyond repair. You could try and glue it if you wanted to, but the torque, it's got to really be a solid piece, otherwise it's not going to hold that motor in place. Now, putting a battery across the motor terminals proves that the motor still works, so that's a good thing, as these motors, I cannot find a spare online of this type at the moment. Now, I'm going to have to try and find a bracket for this, because like I said, this type of motor that's also fitted to Hornby's Tornado is not available at the moment as a spare part. So I'm just going to remove the DCC blanking plug, and then you have to remove this screw that removes this additional weight piece at the front, and then that reveals yet another screw that holds the valves etc. in place. So you have to undo 3 or 4 screws just to get the valve gear off. So I'm going to remove that, and I'm also going to remove the cylinders. These are held in place with a screw from the underside. Now, going through my box of bits and pieces, I knew I had some A4 spares knocking around somewhere, and luckily enough I had a cylinder block going spare. Again, couldn't find one of these online for this particular model. So I've set the loco aside now, and I'm going to focus on the tender and get those tender wheels sorted. So I undo the keeper plate. You have to undo 3 screws, including the one that holds the body shell on. And then the wheels are a simple lift out. They clip in place, although 2 of the clips were broken. Again, I think this model was dropped on the floor. Now, to refit these tyres, I actually took the wheels off the axles and then gently hammered the tyres back on. I tried to use finger pressure and a set of smooth nose pliers, but they just weren't having it. It wasn't going on right. So I took them off and then tapped it gently all the way around until the tyre was back on the plastic insert. And then the wheels were put back on the axle and the back-to-back measurement was checked. It's fairly easy to do, no quartering or anything needed, and they are just a push fit. So both wheels were repaired this way, and then they were refitted to the model, having been cleaned, although there was very little in the way of dirt on them at all. Now the back, the buffers, again, no spares available. So what I did was, I opened up the buffer shafts because they've got a weird shelf like a third of the way in where the original buffers would have sat. So I opened the shaft up and I'm going to just use some standard push-in Hornby buffers. Now these are slightly too small for the shaft, but as it's the tender back and you're not going to see it much, I am actually going to just use these and super glue these in place. Now what I did here, I put the super glue in the actual buffer housing. What I should have done was put it on the buffer shank, but I didn't think. So if you do it, put it on the buffer shank, less likely to get any on the paintwork then. But just a couple of seconds holding it, and the glue sets and holds it in place, and then the other buffer was put back in the same way, and that has repaired the rear of the tender. And these buffers, like I said, they wouldn't have been polished, and they were just standard round tender buffers being on the inside. Now this handrail clip here is broken, so what I'm going to do here is, again, very tiny amount of super glue. I'm confident enough to use it out the tube, but if you want to do this, you can always put a bit on a bit of plastic and use a pin. And then out with the hammer again, and I just tap this a few times on the work table just to flatten the metal all back out, because that tender drawbar had been bent quite badly, either when it fell off on the floor or when somebody's picked it up. And once it was straightened out, it was a case of screwing it back onto the tender. Now I thought I'd done this wrong initially, because it is a very loose and it's a very loose fit, but apparently that's how it's supposed to be. So now the tender's done, I'm going to turn my attention back to the loco part, and I'm going to remove the linkages and valve gear. I removed the crank pins from each side and that screw on the top, and the whole ensemble lifts up. Now I am pretty confident that I can bend this back into shape without having to spend anything on spares. So using my long, smooth tweezer nose pliers, I'm going to attempt to bend this back into shape. So I've speed the footage up a little bit of me doing this, but it was a case of bending a little and then comparing it to the other side that wasn't badly bent, and just working carefully, making sure that none of the rivets popped, nothing was catching, and making sure that everything was straight and true. And I did this by eye, but again, I didn't want to find online that there was no spares available for this model. But eventually, after about 20 minutes work, I'm satisfied that everything is as straight as I'm going to get it, and it's bent all back into place. So the new cylinder block is put on, the piston rods and slide valves are put in, they're lined up and then just pushed on, and then the cylinder block is screwed onto the chassis by replacing the screw we took out earlier. And then moving the motor out of the way, I put the chassis on a piece of track and then gently push it forwards and backwards to make sure nothing is locking up. And as you can see, it is rolling very freely, which proves to me that I've straightened the rods out. Nothing is catching. The quartering is okay. Now, turning my attention to the motor, I actually had this old motor in my spares. This is a completely dead motor off an old Tornado. In fact, when I tried to do it with the control, it was emitting smoke. But I removed the flywheel because it had a good bracket on the back. Now, you cannot buy these brackets as spares. And the footage of me removing the flywheel, etc., was lost. Now, I couldn't get a gear puller to fit the flywheel. So what I did was I held the flywheel in a vise and gently tapped the shaft out of the flywheel with an old solid drill bit, working very gently so not to damage the motor. And then I swapped the motor retainer over, and then put the motor back in the vise here, and then just squeezed it up gently to replace that flywheel on the shaft. And that is the motor bracket replaced. Now, I made that look simple. In reality, that was about a 30-40 minute job. But like I said, some of the footage of this, me doing that, got lost. But it was basically tapped out and then reassembled. So now that the motor has got a fresh bracket on it, I'm just going to test this by holding it in place with my fingers. Battery on the terminals, and the motor is spinning the wheels nicely. Again, nothing is catching. So now I know that the motor works fine and the flywheel's okay. I'm going to refit these two screws that we took out earlier, and that will be the motor reassembled and reattached to the chassis as it should be. I did put a small amount of Labelle 106 grease on the worm gear, but as I said earlier, the grease on this model was virtually brand new. There was very little dirt in it at all. The DCC interface was screwed back down. The blanking plate was put back in, and then it was time to track test the model. And it's now running lovely. It's running quite smoothly and nice. And that flywheel really does make a big difference. So I'm going to DCC fit this model. Obviously, as my layout's digital. Very simple. Remove the blanking plate. Decoder of my choice, which is what I had in the toolbox, which in this case is just a Hornby chip, and the 8 pins line up when I can get it to line up because one of the pins was slightly bent. Plug that in and the model's now DCC fitted. So I tidy the wires up and I add some black tack to the metal chassis weight and put the decoder on there, so the decoder's sat on the black tack and it's not going to short out. Chassis is refitted to the model body shell, and then the retaining screw, which I had to find a spare one of, and luckily I had one in my screw pot, is refixed. Now I do end up taking the body off again shortly, but I'll explain why later. While the model was in the cradle, I removed the base keeper plate to gain access to the pickups because the middle wheels were not picking up electricity, so I just give these a quick clean over. Again, not that there was any dust on them, it's just a matter of course just to make sure everything is nice and clean. I didn't oil or lubricate the axles as these were fine. So I then make sure all the pickups are touching the wheel backs and adjust the ones if necessary, and then put the base keeper plate back on, reattach the screws that we took out, and then I'm going to do a battery test to make sure that all 6 driving wheels are picking up. Now, because this model has no tender pickups, it's imperative that all wheels are picking up power, otherwise you're going to end up with a stuttering model on points, etc. Then, as a matter of course, I clean all the driving wheels just to make sure everything's as clean as it can be, using a cotton bud of meths. Front bogie wheel was refitted. If you ever do take one of these models apart, there is a small plastic washer on the screw. If you ever remove the front bogie, so try not to lose that because it does space the screw and the bogie out correctly. So this was refitted and we are really now cracking on with this rebuild. Let me know in the comments below if you think that this model was dropped on the floor. Now Peter never actually said, but I reckon it must have been dropped at some point. Now the rear pony wheel, even though it's flangeless, is not turning very well. So I remove it and then find that one of the wheels on here, the tyre has shifted on the wheel insert again. But this time it was just a case of using some pliers, again smooth tooth pliers, just to pull that back and onto the wheel insert. And then I also found a screw that was stuck in there with a bit of grease, so that was also preventing the wheel turning, but I'm not sure where the screw came from, as all the screws apart from the body securing screw had been accounted for this model. So now that flangeless wheel is back in there, and then the cover plate is refitted. And then I also found this is a set of brake rigging for an A4. So I decided to fit this, even though one of the brake shoes is missing, the bottom left hand corner one is missing. There is sufficient left to hold the brake rigging in place. So I fit this by pushing the plastic lugs into the holes in the brake shoes. It's just a little detail that just adds something a little extra to the model. Now, as I said earlier on, I'm not keen on this railroad budget printing. This is my spare body shell I've got that doesn't actually fit this chassis. And I've managed to salvage a safety valve that was missing. So that can be pushed back into place in the roof of this Mallard. And it also had the whistle, so that was salvaged as well. And then that was also put on the front of the model in the hole where the original whistle had been. You'll also note there that because my A4 will run on the garden railway and will need to run around its stock, I've also fitted the front NEM coupling to this model. Now, as I was saying, I'm not keen on the printing on this model. It's just bog standard basic gold lettering for LNER. Now, it was never like that in real life, I don't think. And I prefer the more elaborate lining. So I've got a sheet of Model Master decals. And I'm going to just overlay these decals on the Hornby printed lettering. Now, it is a very simple thing to do, and I've done this on numerous railroad models in the past. As you can see, some of the decals have been used. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out some numbers and decals, and then all I do is with some warm water just put a small amount of water over one of the letters, and when the decal is thoroughly soaked, using a cocktail stick, I slide it off onto the tender body, and then basically line it up with the printed detail. Now doing this ensures that not only is the lettering level and evenly spaced, but it also just adds that little bit of finesse to the model. I really do not like this basic printing. Now I don't buy that it makes the model cheaper. I just think it's laziness, if I'm totally honest, because that looks so much better. Now don't worry about the carrier film, that will disappear shortly. So what I do is I replace all of the lettering on the tender and the loco number using these transfers. And then what I'm going to do is when it's thoroughly dry, I'm going to remove the body shell from the chassis, mask up the coal and the cab front, basically all the black parts of the body shell that I don't want to be semi-gloss, and I'm going to give the body shell and the tender body shell a coat of Tamiya clear coat. Now you'll see here just what a difference that's made to the numbers and lettering. It really has made a big difference, and you could really go to town on this and put builder's plates and everything on it if you wanted to. The only thing is, on this side, not only did I get the 8 skew width, but I ran out of number 4s. But my friend John has supplied a couple, and I will fit them after this video, as I won't be able to pick them up. But what I'll do now is, like I said, I'll give it a coat of this Tamiya TS13 clear, which will leave a semi-gloss museum-like finish. But I will mask up all this black stuff and the cab roof on the model, and just like magic, you will see now that it makes the model, not only has it got a lovely semi-gloss sheen to it, but it will seal those transfers in place. And even though all I've done is replace those lettering, it's made a massive difference to this model. That original printing, I just can't stand. I've just realised that I forgot to replace that handrail there, so I'll have to get round to doing that as well. So I'm going to give the model a quick track test to make sure everything is working and that I've not trapped any wires or anything when I put that body shell back on. And you can see there the lovely sheen that TS13 has left on the model. Now on DC, the model simply refused to run backwards, but that is the chip, that isn't the model itself. Last thing to do is to reattach the tender to the locomotive itself, and if I really wanted to and put the work in, I could add tender pickups to this model, but I might save that and do that in a future video depending on how it runs just with the pickups on the driving wheels. Now for a budget model, the Hornby Railroad A4 is a really good model. It uses the same body shell tooling as their main range. The front buffer beam is removable, etc., and it really does look a nice looking model. It's just, it needs enhancing slightly with some transfers, as I've done here, and I hope you'll agree that's just set it off just nicely. I may come back to this, like I said, and do a bit more detail and add some cab windows, etc., and a driver and fireman, but I'll save that for a future video. If you've got an engine or anything you'd like to see featured on a future episode of Trash to Track, please email me at dansmodelrailways@gmail.com. Have a look and get it sent over, and who knows, it may even feature in an episode all of its own. I'll leave you now with some shots of Mallard running around the layout on a charter rake. If only the real thing worked in real life. And I hope you'll agree we've managed to restore this model from dropped on the floor, bad condition, to a lovely functioning model of the world's fastest steam engine. And the irony is not lost on me that this is episode 126, and that's also the miles an hour that Mallard reached to gain the record. Thanks again for watching Trash to Track. Please like, share and subscribe, and I will catch you all in the next video. Bye for now.